welcome to Today in Psychology with your host, Dr. Ruth. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce my guest, Gabby. Welcome to the show, Gabby.
Thank you, Dr. Ruth. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, today's topic is violent video games and their effects on aggression. In the field of psychology, violent video games are very controversial because of their potential psychological impact on aggression and aggressive behavior. Ever since the first violent video game was released in the early 1990s, their popularity has grown exponentially, especially among children, adolescents, and teens, since they're often the target audience of such media. But before diving into the details, I want to hear Gabby's take on the subject. Gabby?
Well, Dr. Ruth, I play violent video games pretty frequently. My favorite game right now is Skyrim, and that's a first-person game involving lots of battles and murders and blood. But I can say confidently that playing games like this hasn't made me an angrier person, and quite frankly, I don't understand how anybody could argue that video games make people more angry.
Yes, that's a very common opinion that I've heard many times. However, there's an abundance of evidence that confirms violent video games do in fact lead to increased aggression. For example, a study conducted earlier this year by Mary Ballard, a professor of psychology at Appalachian State University, provides evidence that increased cardiovascular reactivity, meaning changes in heart rate and blood pressure in response to stimuli, is correlated with higher levels of aggression. In her study, she evaluated the impact of cardiovascular arousal on the decision to shoot a person of color first in a video game shooting task, and found that the two are correlated as well.
Huh, that's interesting. I never thought about how heart functions like blood pressure could affect aggression, especially in the context of violent video games. But I'm still not convinced that violent video games are harmful. My little sister plays, or she loves to play, in fact, Grand Theft Auto, and that's filled with injuring and killing others and stealing vehicles and shooting at cops, and she still seems fine and not aggressive.
I think it's very common for children to play violent video games, but that's because the longitudinal effects of playing these games are not yet well understood. According to Jessica Morrison, Meredith Elsie, and Laura Jelson-Swain, playing violent video games in childhood may lead to the desensitization to violence, which correlates with decreased empathy and/or poor empathy development.
Well, wait a minute. What does empathy have to do with anything?
I'm glad you asked. The development of empathy in childhood is vital to proper societal functioning, connecting with and relating to others, and pro-social behavior in adulthood. Adults with low empathy are often unable to form and maintain relationships with others, which can lead to various mental illnesses, seeing as humans are social creatures and they require connections with peers and loved ones. When you consider the fact that children and adolescents are often the target audience of violent video games, it makes this evidence even more troubling. The young age, influenceability, vulnerability, and the sensitivity of children and adolescents that play violent video games is cause for concern, especially considering the spike in video game use that correlated with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
That makes a lot of sense. After hearing about how violent video games can affect empathy, I do feel more concerned about them. But are you saying that nobody should ever play violent video games ever?
No, of course not. Video games have also been proven to relieve stress, evoke positive emotions, and enhance cognitive abilities. Especially during the COVID-19 pandemic that seems like it will never end, finding ways to manage stress is very important. However, I do think the frequency that children, adolescents, and teens use violent video games should be reduced because of the nearly overwhelming amount of evidence suggesting they have the potential to increase levels of aggression and aggressive behavior.
Well, now I understand how and why violent video games can affect the brain. I have to agree that the use of those games among younger audience needs to be managed. I know a lot of kids and teens that play video games for hours at a time, and now I know how harmful they can be. I can't imagine the constant exposure to violence and engagement in virtual violent behaviors is going to be any good for them.
Well, I'm just so glad that you learned something new on my talk show today. Thank you for tuning in to Today in Psychology with Dr. Ruth, and we'll see you next time.